The road to Glenstone doesn't look like the road to a museum. It looks like the road to somebody's house, because for a long stretch, that's exactly what it was. Mitchell Rales bought this land outside Potomac, Maryland, back in 1986 and lived there for 2 decades before most of the art world had heard the name. Today, you still can't just drive up. You reserve a time slot weeks or months in advance, hand your ID to a guide dressed head to toe in gray at a gatehouse, and get waved through onto grounds that hide one of the largest private art museums in the country, a museum that on paper isn't private at all. You'd assume a billionaire building a museum is basically an expensive form of generosity. Buy the art, put up the building, let people in, take the deduction, done. That's the fantasy. The reality is stranger. A private museum is one of the only structures in America where someone can give away hundreds of millions of dollars in property in the eyes of the law and keep almost everything that made it valuable in the first place. Not the art itself, technically, but the control over it, the land underneath it, the board that runs it, sometimes the house next door. So the real question isn't what it costs to build one of these. It's why anyone would go through the trouble of giving a collection away and then build a gate to make sure it's hard to see. Start with what actually goes into the ground. In 2018, Glenstone finished an expansion, 11 interlocking rooms wrapped around a water court, plus more than 200 acres of new grounds that ran past $200 million. That's before a single painting went on the wall, before staff, security, conservation, insurance, and the horticulture team it takes to keep that much land looking untouched. And admission is free. No ticket price, no gift shop margin doing any real work. Just free. Free doesn't mean easy to get into, though. Tickets are released once a month on the 1st at 10 in the morning, and by visitor accounts, people set alarms for it, refreshing a booking page the way you'd fight for concert seats, except nothing's being sold, and the crowd is capped at a few hundred people a day, 4 days a week. That's not an accident. Unlimited free access would wreck the whole point of the place. Scarcity here isn't a flaw in the model, it is the model, which sharpens the paradox. A museum that costs nothing to enter is one of the hardest tickets in the mid-Atlantic, and the family that built it still lives on the property, still runs the foundation, still decides who gets in and when. So what exactly did they actually give away? Here's the part that never makes it into the press photos. When a collector donates art to somewhere like the Met, they lose it, not just physically, legally. The board isn't theirs anymore. The building isn't theirs. The moment the deduction clears, so does their say in the matter. A private museum works differently. Structure it as what the IRS calls a private operating foundation, and the rules bend. The founder can sit on the board and keep voting at their own meetings, site the museum on land they already own, keep the collection under a name that's essentially their own, and still claim the deduction as though they'd handed the art to a fully public institution, up to 50% of adjusted gross income in the year of the gift, compared with 30% for an ordinary private foundation that just writes checks to other charities. In exchange, the foundation actually has to operate. It has to spend most of its investment income directly on the museum itself, not just let the assets sit and compound. And it has to offer some real public benefit, not zero access, just enough. A private museum, in other words, isn't really built to display a collection. It's built to prove just convincingly enough that it could. If you had a collection worth hundreds of millions of dollars, would you rather hand it to an institution you no longer control, or build one you still do, in exchange for opening the doors a little? There's a real decision buried in there, and it's not as easy as it sounds. The trouble is, nobody has ever pinned down what enough means. In 2015, the New York Times went looking at how open these museums actually were, and what it found got the Senate Finance Committee's attention. Its chairman, Orrin Hatch, sent letters to 11 private museums: Peter Brandt's Foundation in Connecticut, the Goss-Michael Foundation that George Michael built with his partner in Dallas, Eli Broad's Museum in Los Angeles, the Rubens Collection in Miami, Glenstone among them. asking how many hours a week they were actually open, how many people came, and who sat on the board. The answers, gathered into Hatch's own summary, were uneven enough to be uncomfortable. Some institutions were quietly hosting 500,000 free visitors a year. Others kept the doors open as little as 20 hours a week, then closed entirely for 2 or 3 months at a stretch. Several sat on land the founder still owned. A few sat next door to the founder's own house. At Glenstone, Emily Rales, Mitchell's wife and the museum's director, took the scrutiny personally. By her own account afterwards, she found it frustrating rather than fair. The foundation had already sought and received a private ruling from the IRS confirming its plans were compliant, and she felt reducing an institution built around slow, unhurried looking to a raw visitor count missed the point of what they'd made. The investigators, she said, never took her up on the offer to actually come see it for themselves. Congress tried briefly to settle the ambiguity with an actual number. A 2017 House tax bill would have required any museum using this foundation structure to stay open to the public at least 1,000 hours a year, roughly 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 6 months out of 12, or lose the tax benefit outright. It didn't survive the final bill. It was stripped out before signing, without much public explanation from anyone involved. Which means the exact ambiguity that triggered a Senate investigation in 2015 is still sitting in the tax code today, and there's no sign anyone in Washington has tried to reopen the question since.
Scrutiny from Washington isn't actually the scariest part of this business, though. Building the thing is. When Glenstone brought in HIT Contracting to manage its $200 million expansion, the relationship didn't survive to the finish line. Days before the October 2018 opening, HIT sued the museum's foundation for $24 million, claiming disorganized management had forced the company and its subcontractors to keep self-funding the work for months at a stretch while waiting to get paid. Glenstone's lawyer countered that HIT had delivered the project 10 months late and millions over budget, and that the dispute was simply about who owed whom. Whoever was right, the lesson underneath it holds either way. Even with what amounts to an open checkbook, a project at this scale can still spiral into a legal fight nobody wanted, right up to the week the ribbon gets cut. And once the building exists, the costs don't go away. A foundation can't just sell off a painting to cover a rough year. Self-dealing rules and the foundation's own charitable purpose make that far messier than it sounds, even when the founder is the one who bought the piece in the first place. The art goes in, it mostly doesn't come back out. Which means the real ongoing cost was never the construction bill. It's that conservation, security, and insurance and staff have to be funded forever, whether or not the founder's fortune keeps growing at the rate it was the year the building went up. The operators who make this work for decades tend to lean into one of two very different strategies. Mitchell Rales chose to make the money question irrelevant. In 2021, he gave Glenstone another $1.9 billion, pushing the foundation's total endowment to roughly $4.6 billion, within range of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's own endowment, an institution built over a century, drawing millions of visitors a year instead of a few hundred a day. That kind of endowment isn't an operating budget. It's a permanent insurance policy against ever needing outside money or ever needing to compromise on access again. Eli Broad, surveyed in that same 2015 Senate inquiry alongside Glenstone, solved it differently by leaning toward genuinely mass access from the start. His museum, which opened in downtown Los Angeles in 2015 for around $140 million, was built free, walkable, and central, designed to pull in a crowd rather than filter one down to a few hundred people a day. Both museums answered the same letter from the same committee. Only one of them had an easy answer to give. Which brings you back to that gatehouse. It isn't there to protect the art. Insurance already covers that risk regardless of headcount, and most of the work could survive a crowd just fine. It's there because the gate is the actual mechanism. It's the visible proof that access exists, sized carefully enough to never threaten the control the family kept the day they signed the foundation paperwork. The gate isn't guarding the museum. In a real sense, the gate is the museum, the part of this whole arrangement still doing economic work years after the ribbon cutting and long after that year's tax return got filed. So here's a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. If you had a collection worth building a museum around, would you take the Glenstone route, control, scarcity, and endowment big enough to never worry again, or the Broad route, free and wide open, betting that being genuinely public is worth more than staying in charge of it. I'd be curious which one you'd actually choose, because it's a harder call than it sounds. And if you like finding the mechanism hiding underneath something that looks on the surface like simple generosity, that's the whole point of this channel. There's another one of these worth pulling apart next.